The Timekeeper's crown, the storm had rolled in without warning, thick clouds swallowing the stars as rain lashed against the ivory keep. Queen Isolde sat alone in her chamber, her mind adrift in the echoes of parchment and ink. The royal archive sprawled before her, ancient scrolls detailing the history of Eldoria, its kings, its queens, the battles fought, the treaties forged. But something had always gnawed at her, a sense that the stories passed down were incomplete. The castle's oldest records hinted at a relic hidden deep within its stone walls, a time-worn artifact lost to memory, a key to a past unspoken, a relic said to exist only in legend, a clock. The thought had lingered in her mind for weeks, growing like ivy upon the stone of her thoughts. The ivory keep was old, far older than even the first recorded kings. Its foundations whispered of an era beyond parchment and ink. And tonight, as thunder rattled the stained glass windows, something within her stirred. She rose, her silken cloak trailing behind her, and left the warmth of her chamber. The torches burned low in the corridors, flickering like dying stars as she moved through the empty halls. Servants and guards had long since retired, leaving the castle in a hush of midnight silence. She followed instinct rather than reason, her steps carrying her toward the northern wing, where the air grew stale with centuries of dust. The Hall of Ancestors lay before her, a vast corridor lined with portraits of monarchs long gone. Their painted eyes watched her, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. She traced her fingers along the cold stone, feeling for something unseen, something wrong. And then, a breath of wind where there should have been none. A hidden draught whispered against her skin, carrying the scent of aged parchment and something older, something metallic. Her hand paused over a carved relief of the first queen, Seraphina, the woman who had forged Eldoria's first alliance. A queen whose history was filled with triumph, and yet curiously absent of struggle. Isolde pressed against the stone. With a deep groan, the wall shifted. A seam appeared, a hidden door swinging inward, revealing darkness beyond. The breath of wind returned, cool and knowing. A forgotten chamber. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, motes swirling in the candlelight as she lifted her torch. Shelves lined the walls, filled with tomes whose bindings had long since withered. Scrolls lay scattered across an ancient wooden table, their ink faded with time. But it was what stood at the center of the chamber that stole her breath. An ornate clock, taller than any she had ever seen. Its frame was wrought of silver and obsidian, its face inlaid with symbols she did not recognize. The hands did not tick forward, nor did they remain still. They shimmered, flickering between moments unseen, bending time itself in their delicate movements. She stepped closer, drawn by an unseen force. The moment her fingertips brushed the cool metal, the world shifted. The torches flickered and died. The floor beneath her vanished. Darkness consumed her. Then, light. A golden glow burst forth from the clock, its gears whirring with an unseen energy. The chamber around her melted away, dissolving into mist, and suddenly she was standing somewhere else. The scent of lilies and burning wood filled her lungs. The walls of the chamber had transformed, the tapestries displaying sigils she did not recognize. The air was thick with candlelight, and the murmur of voices just beyond the door. This was not her time. A chill ran down her spine as she turned toward the mirror that stood in the corner of the room. Her reflection was not her own. The face staring back at her bore her features, but her crown was different. An older design, adorned with the gemstones of a past age. Her gown was not the midnight silk she had worn that evening, but the heavy brocade of an era long gone. She was standing in the past. The realization struck her like a bell tolling in the depths of her mind. She had touched the clock, and it had answered. This was a moment that had already been lived, a moment in Eldoria's history. She turned toward the door as the voices grew louder. Whoever was on the other side would expect her, or rather, the queen whose place she had taken. The weight of time itself settled upon her shoulders. The Timekeeper's crown had awakened, and now she was bound to the echoes of the past. The air in the chamber was thick with the weight of a time not her own. Queen Isolde forced herself to steady her breath, her pulse a drumbeat against her ribs. The hands of the clock had twisted her into the past, and now she stood in the body of a queen long dead, staring at a door behind which voices murmured with expectation. She had spent her life mastering composure, whether in the presence of foreign emissaries, unruly lords, or the weight of her own doubts. And yet, this moment felt different. She was not merely wearing a crown, she was wearing history itself. The door creaked open. A man entered, dressed in robes of deep crimson, the silver sigil of Eldoria embroidered upon his chest. His eyes, keen and unwavering, swept over her with familiarity, though Isolde had never seen him before in her life. "Your Majesty," he said, inclining his head. His voice carried a reverence that sent a chill through her. She could not falter now. Whoever this man was, he believed her to be the queen of this time. She straightened her shoulders and inclined her chin, slipping into the role necessity had thrust upon her. "What is it?" she asked, willing her voice to remain steady. "The council awaits your decision." The council. A flicker of realization dawned upon her. She was standing in the reign of one of her ancestors. But which? What decision had been made in this chamber? What path had been taken? Isolde stepped forward, her mind racing. If she was to walk this moment, she needed knowledge. And yet, knowledge was precisely what had been stripped from her. The man studied her, his expression unreadable. "Your Majesty?" She had no choice but to play the part. "Lead me to them," she commanded. The corridors of the castle were both familiar and foreign. The stone was the same, the tapestries woven with the same sigils, yet the flickering torches and the scent of burning cedar spoke of a different age. The servants bowed as she passed, their gazes carefully averted, and in their silence Isolde felt the deep hum of history's presence. She was walking through a moment already written, yet unknown to her. The doors of the council chamber loomed before her, and when they swung open, she stepped into a world not meant for her. 12 men sat at the great round table, their faces marked with the weight of governance. Scrolls lay unfurled before them, quills poised in hands that had written the fate of nations. The air was thick with tension, though Isolde did not yet know why. They all rose as she entered. "Your Majesty," one of them spoke, "we require your word." She took her seat at the head of the table, the weight of a crown unfamiliar upon her brow. She forced herself to speak carefully. "Remind me of the matter before us." A pause, a flicker of hesitation in the eyes of the councillors. "The proposal of peace with the East," the man finally said. "The envoy from the Etherian kingdom awaits your answer." Isolde's breath caught. The Etherian kingdom. A name from Eldoria's past, one that no longer existed in her own time. She had been thrown into a moment that had shaped the world she had inherited. A decision that had either forged an alliance or a war, and she did not know which. The weight of history pressed against her, an unseen force demanding she make the same choice her ancestor had. But had that choice been just? Had it been right? She searched the faces of the men before her, but none revealed the answers she needed. The past had been written in ink, yet she had been thrown into it with no knowledge of its script. And then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. "You must not alter the course." The world seemed to still. The council did not react. They did not hear the voice. But Isolde did. She turned her gaze, and there, in the dim light beyond the council chamber's pillars, a figure stood. A man cloaked in black, his face hidden beneath the hood of time itself. The same figure she had glimpsed in the paintings of history. The one who did not belong, yet was always there. The air grew thick with something unseen. "You have touched the Timekeeper's crown," the voice murmured. "You have stepped where none should walk." Isolde's fingers curled against the armrest of her throne. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely above breath. But the figure did not answer. He merely raised a hand and pointed to the clock, the one she had not seen before. It stood behind her, its hands frozen in place, shimmering with the silver light of something beyond understanding. And then she knew. This was not merely a moment in history. This was a test. The clock had not only sent her back, it had placed her within the decision itself. She could choose as her ancestor had, sealing the fate of Eldoria as it was written. Or she could alter the course of time. The councillors were waiting. The envoy was waiting. History itself was waiting. Isolde turned her gaze back to the table, the weight of time pressing upon her like an unseen force. What choice had been made before? And what choice would she make now? The clock behind her trembled, its hands warring between past and future. And in that moment, the fate of Eldoria hung in the balance. The council chamber was silent, the weight of expectation pressing against Isolde like the thick stone walls that surrounded her. The men before her did not know, could not know, that their queen was not the woman they had served, that she was a phantom of the future, a ghost woven into the threads of history by a clock whose power defied reason. She was trapped in a moment, already written, yet the ink had not yet dried. Her mind raced. The envoy from the Etherean kingdom awaited her answer. The council poised for her decree. In her own time, the Etherean kingdom did not exist. Its fate had been sealed here, in this very room. The masked figure lingered in the shadows, unseen by all but her. His warning echoed in her mind. You must not alter the course. But how could she choose blindly? If she followed the path her ancestor had taken, she would preserve history as it was. But was that path just? Had it led to prosperity, or had it been the first stone in a road paved with ruin? She lifted her chin, willing her voice to steady. Tell me of the envoy, she said. Remind me of their offer. A man with parchment-stained fingers cleared his throat. The Etherean kingdom seeks peace, he said carefully. They propose a binding treaty, trade routes, military alliance. In return, they ask for our word. A pact that we will not cross their borders with steel in hand. Another counselor, an older man with eyes like cold embers, scoffed. Etheria is weak. Their offer is one of desperation. We could claim their lands with little resistance. And if we refuse? Isolde asked. The first man hesitated. Then they will prepare for war. A choice, peace or conquest. Her breath was slow, measured, though her mind spun. If Etheria had fallen in her time, then war had come. Had her ancestor rejected the offer? Had Eldoria's strength swallowed its neighbor whole? Or had they taken the treaty only for betrayal to follow? The weight of history settled upon her shoulders. Then softly, too softly for the council to hear, the figure in the shadows spoke. This choice was made once before, he murmured. You walk a path already trodden. Isolde turned her gaze to him. And what choice was made? He did not answer. He simply watched, his presence as silent as the passage of time. She clenched her jaw. A ruler did not rule by waiting for the past to whisper its secrets. She turned to the council. Summon the envoy, she said. Murmurs swept through the chamber. The councillors exchanged glances, but none dared question her command. A guard was sent to retrieve the Etherean emissary. The masked figure did not move, but Isolde felt the weight of his unseen stare. She had already diverged from the past, and she did not yet know what it would cost. A moment later, the envoy entered. He was younger than she expected, draped in dark robes, his eyes sharp with wary intelligence. He bowed low. "Your Majesty," he greeted. Isolde studied him. If war had come, if his people had been erased from history, then this man's name had been lost to time. But he was here now, standing before her. "We stand at a crossroads," she said carefully. "Tell me, emissary, why does Etheria seek peace?" The man lifted his gaze. "Because war will end us," he said simply. "We do not seek conflict. We seek survival. But if you refuse, we will fight for as long as we can stand." His voice did not waver. The older counselor scoffed again. "They are weak," he repeated. "Their survival is a matter of time. Why should we bind our hands when conquest is within our grasp?" Isolde met the envoy's gaze. "And if we accept, then we will stand beside you," the man said. "Our fleets will guard your waters. Our warriors will be your shield. A promise, a plea, and a test." Isolde turned to the clock. It stood silent now, its hands frozen, waiting. She exhaled slowly. "I have decided." The chamber fell into hushed anticipation. Then, in a voice that did not waver, she spoke. "Eldoria does not make war for greed," she said. "We shall take the hand of Etheria and bind it in peace." A hush fell over the room. For a moment, the council did not move. Then, the emissary let out a breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "You have chosen well, Your Majesty," he said, bowing. The clock trembled. The masked figure shifted in the shadows. Isolde knew. She had made a different choice. This was not the path her ancestor had taken. She could feel it in the way time itself seemed to hum, restless and uncertain. And then before her eyes, the chamber began to fade. The walls dissolved into mist, the voices of the council fading into echoes of something unfinished. The past was slipping away. The clock's hands spun wildly, the silver glow of its magic twisting around her. She had changed something, and time was correcting itself. Darkness closed in, swallowing her whole. And then, silence. She was falling. No, not falling. Moving. The mist parted, and she stood once more in the hidden chamber. The silver clock before her, its magic dimming. The past was gone. The choice had been made. But what had she altered? Her breath came in slow, shallow gulps as she steadied herself. Then she turned and froze. A figure stood at the entrance of the chamber. Not the masked stranger. Not a phantom of history. A man clad in royal regalia, his face carved from memory, his eyes dark with something unreadable. A man who should not exist. The Etherian envoy. But he was no envoy now. He wore a crown, and he was looking at her with recognition. The past had changed, and the future had changed with it. The chamber was silent, but for the whispering hum of the clock, its silver hands now frozen as though time itself held its breath. Queen Isolde stood unmoving, the weight of her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. Before her stood the man who should not exist, the envoy of Etheria, the man whose kingdom had vanished into the pages of forgotten history. And yet here he was, standing within the ivory keep, no longer dressed in the sombre robes of a diplomat, but in the regalia of a ruler. A crown sat upon his brow. The realization hit her like a blow. The past had shifted, and so had the future. The man, no, the king, studied her with the sharp gaze of one who saw too much. There was no confusion in his eyes, no bewilderment at the chamber, the ancient clock, or even her presence. He knew. "You're not surprised to see me," Isolde said, her voice careful. The man tilted his head. A flicker of something, amusement, curiosity, passed over his face before he answered. "Should I be?" His voice was the same as before, steady, calculated. Yet now there was something else within it. Authority. She took a slow breath. "You were an envoy?" "I was," he agreed. "Once. And now I am the king of Etheria." Etheria. A kingdom that should have been dust. A kingdom that, in her time, had ceased to exist. The implication struck her with a slow, creeping dread. She had altered the past. Etheria had survived. It had not been conquered. Its history had not been erased. And that meant Eldoria's own history had changed as well. "Impossible," she murmured, shaking her head. "I returned to my own time. I should have..." The words died on her tongue. Was this her own time? The chamber looked the same. The castle felt the same. And yet, there was an undercurrent of something else. A wrongness she could not yet name. The man, King Etherian, she realized, for his name had been lost to her, stepped forward. "You altered the moment," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "You chose peace when war had once been inevitable." The air in the chamber seemed thinner, the weight of the clock's presence pressing upon them both. "You knew this would happen," she accused. "You expected me to change something." The king did not deny it. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the clock, his expression unreadable. "I have walked these halls before," he murmured. "But in another time, a different path. One where Eldoria crushed my kingdom, where my name was erased." He turned back to her. "But that is not this time. Not anymore." Isolde swallowed hard. "And Eldoria?" she asked. The king's eyes darkened. "You will have to see for yourself." A cold shiver ran through her. She turned sharply, her steps carrying her from the chamber, her heart hammering against her ribs. The halls were familiar, and yet subtly different. The banners that lined the stone walls were not the ones she had known. The sigils bore the mark of Eldoria, but entwined with a new emblem. A crest she did not recognize. Etheria's crest. Panic tightened around her lungs. She strode faster, her thoughts a storm of confusion and fear. Servants passed her in the halls, bowing with reverence, but she saw the flickers of something else in their eyes. Deference, but not the kind owed solely to their queen. A throne shared. Number she reached the great doors of the throne room, her fingers curling against the cold iron. She did not hesitate. She shoved them open. The sight that met her stole the breath from her chest. 2 thrones, One bore the sigil of Eldoria, the other Etheria, and both were occupied. Her own throne, the seat of her ancestors, was still hers. But beside it sat the man who had once been an envoy, the man who should not have lived beyond that council chamber, King Etherian, her equal, a ruler not of a fallen kingdom, but of one that had risen beside hers. Her gaze swept the room. The lords and ladies of Eldoria stood in quiet reverence, their expressions neither shocked nor confused, because to them this was not strange. This was history, their history, a new history. Her knees felt weak. She gripped the edge of her throne to steady herself. The masked figure, the warning, you must not alter the course. And yet she had. Time had not unraveled. It had reshaped. She turned to King Etherian. He met her gaze with a knowing look, his expression betraying nothing of the chaos that raged within her own heart. How long? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The faintest of smiles ghosted across his lips. 5 years, he said. 5 years. She had left her time for mere moments. Yet here, in this world, 5 years had passed beneath a rule she had never lived. 5 years of a reign she did not remember. Her fingers clenched at her sides. What had she done? What else had changed? And then, as if in answer to the storm of questions within her mind, the great doors of the throne room swung open once more. A guard entered, his face grave. "Your Majesties," he announced, bowing deeply. "Not your Majesty, your Majesty." The weight of it pressed against her, suffocating. "There is news from the borderlands," the guard continued. "A force gathers beyond the mountains, not Etherian, not Eldorian." His voice dropped lower. Something unseen before. Etherian's gaze sharpened, and Isolde knew with a sinking certainty that history had not merely changed. It had woken something new. The past had shifted. And the future was no longer written. The words hung in the air like the toll of a distant bell. A force gathers beyond the mountains. Not Etherian, not Eldorian. Something unseen before. Queen Isolde sat frozen upon the throne that had once been hers alone. Her pulse a steady drum against her ribs. Around her, the great hall of the Ivory Keep stirred in uneasy murmurs. Lords and knights exchanged uncertain glances, their hands tightening around the hilts of ceremonial blades. And beside her, King Etherian sat silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. He had ruled alongside her for 5 years. 5 years she had never lived. 5 years stolen from her by the shifting tides of time. She did not know this man, not truly. And yet, history bound them together. Etheria had risen beside Eldoria, entwined like twin branches from the same root. A kingdom saved from the abyss, brought into an alliance that had never existed before. But time does not bend without consequence. And now, something stirred beyond the mountains. Something that had never been before. Slowly, Isolde turned to the guard who had spoken. "Tell me everything." The man straightened. Riders from the eastern watchtower brought word at dawn, he said. A storm lingers at the mountain pass, not of wind or rain, but of shadow. Travelers speak of figures moving within it, shapes without faces, cloaked in mist. The stars are veiled in those lands, and the rivers run black. A hush fell over the court. Isolde's fingers tightened against the armrest of her throne. Etherian leaned forward. Have they made any demands? None, the guard admitted. They do not speak. They do not march as an army might. They simply wait. A shiver ran down Isolde's spine. This was not war as she had known it. This was something else. Something unnatural. Her mind raced back to the chamber of the clock, to the moment she had made her choice. Had she called this upon them? Had she unspooled a thread that had never meant to be pulled? The masked figure's warning echoed in her mind. You must not alter the course. And yet, she had. Etherian's voice cut through the silence. Prepare the riders, he commanded. I will lead an envoy to the pass. A jolt of anger flared in Isolde's chest. You will not go alone, she countered. His eyes flicked toward her, calm and assessing. This kingdom is not yours alone to rule, she reminded him. A pause, then a slow nod. Then we go together. The mountain pass was not as she remembered it. The last time Isolde had ridden these roads, the air had been crisp. The sky an endless blue expanse stretching beyond the peaks. But now, the world felt hollowed. The sun, though high in the sky, cast no warmth. The wind did not stir. Even the trees seemed to bow under an unseen weight. Their branches gnarled and twisted in unnatural shapes. And then, at the crest of the pass, she saw it. The storm. It was unlike anything she had ever beheld. Not of rain nor thunder, but of something deeper, darker. A writhing mass of shadow and mist, churning as though alive. Figures stood within it, not men, not quite. They bore the shape of warriors, their forms shifting with the mist. Their faces were voids, empty as the abyss. They did not move. They did not breathe. They only watched. Etherian's horse shifted uneasily beneath him. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, though it was clear that steel would mean little against what stood before them. One of the figures stepped forward. It did not walk, nor did it glide. It simply was, closer now than before. Though neither she nor Etherian had seen it move, Isolde's breath came slow, steady. Who are you? She called. No answer. Etherian's voice was sharper. Why have you come? The air quivered. Then at last the figure spoke, but it did not speak with words. A sound filled the valley, deep, echoing, like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. A language that was not meant for mortal tongues. Isolde's vision blurred, her thoughts slipping like water through her fingers. The Timekeeper's crown has broken its oath. Etherian stiffened beside her. What does that mean? He demanded. The voices swirled. Time has been rewritten, the order undone. And now, the debt must be paid. A cold dread settled in her bones. She had changed history. And now, time itself had come to collect its price. The storm deepened, the figures shifting within it. Isolde's fingers curled into fists. "No," she whispered. She had spent her life as a ruler, a queen who shaped her own destiny. She would not let unseen forces decide the fate of her kingdom. She turned sharply to Etherean. "The clock," she said. His brow furrowed. "What?" "The clock in the chamber," she pressed. "It sent me back once before. If it still holds power, then perhaps—" She did not need to finish the thought. Etherean understood. And so, without another word, they turned their horses and rode. The chamber of the clock awaited them, untouched since the moment she had first stumbled into it. The silver hands remained frozen, as if waiting. Isolde did not hesitate. She stepped forward, pressing her palm against the cold metal. The world shuddered. The figures from the storm appeared, not in the valley. Here. They emerged from the mist, silent and watching. One of them reached for her. She felt its touch like ice against her skin. Time buckled. She saw all of it. The threads of history unwinding. The roads taken. The ones abandoned. She saw the first queen standing before the clock, whispering the oath that had bound time itself. "In exchange for prosperity, we give ourselves to the will of time." A bargain struck, a bargain broken. She had shattered what was once sealed. And so, she spoke the words that would bind it again. "I return the crown to time. Let history be as it was meant to be." The figures vanished. The mist dissolved. And the world reset. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the chamber alone. The clock was gone. The world outside was as it had been. Etherean was gone. His kingdom had never risen. The past had returned to its original course. Time had reclaimed its due. And yet, as she stepped into the light of the morning sun, she felt something stir within her. A whisper of a name. A memory of a man who had once been king. Etheria was lost to time. But she would never forget. And as she looked out over her kingdom, she knew one thing for certain. History would remember her, would remember her, would remember her, would remember her, would remember her.